I'm standing before the judge, and my fingers won't stop shaking against the polished wood. My son Daniel is across the room, and when he looks at me, it's like I've become a stranger to him. Like he's forgotten every night I stayed awake when pneumonia had him burning with fever. Like the years I set aside my own hopes so he could chase his don't exist anymore. She doesn't understand what she has, he says. And his voice sounds like someone else's. An elderly woman holding on to something she can't manage. Judge Harrison is reading through papers, nodding slightly. Daniel's attorney, a sharp woman in a charcoal suit who's looked through me since I walked in, has this small smile, like she's already decided how this ends. The floor feels unsteady beneath me. 72 years old, and here I am in a courtroom, facing the child I brought into the world. Listening to him ask a judge to take away everything my husband Thomas left me when he passed 6 months ago. When he finally closed his eyes and let go. But they don't know what I'm about to say. Daniel has no idea. I'm going to speak 3 words that will stop everything. 3 words that will drain the color from the judge's face and leave my son without a single thing to say. If you've ever had family turn on you over money, if someone you loved completely ever looked at you like an obstacle instead of a person, you need to hear what comes next. This story isn't just mine. It belongs to every mother who's been dismissed, judged, and cast aside by the children she raised. 6 months ago, everything was different. Thomas was still here, though the cancer was taking him piece by piece. We were happy anyway. 45 years together had taught us that love isn't about the easy days. It's about standing together when everything's falling apart. Thomas had working hands and a good heart. When we married, he owned an old pickup and had this impossible dream about starting a trucking company. I cleaned other people's homes to help pay for diesel. We lived on boxed pasta for months, saving every cent we could. But we did it together. Through exhaustion, through doubt, through everything. The company grew slowly. 1 truck became 2, then 5, eventually 20. We gave 50 families steady work. We bought the house where Daniel grew up, where we marked every birthday, every holiday, every moment that mattered. Daniel was our whole world. We gave him things we never had: good schools, clothes that fit, real vacations, chances we'd never dreamed of. Thomas used to say he worked himself to the bone so our son wouldn't have to struggle the way we did. And Daniel was a wonderful son. Loving, thoughtful, present. He came by every week. He'd wrap his arms around me and say, "Mom, you're everything." Thomas and I would catch each other's eyes with that look only parents know. The look that says, we did something right. We raised someone good. Everything shifted 3 years ago. Daniel met Claire at some conference. She was polished, always in heels and expensive perfume, always perfectly put together. The first time he brought her over, I felt it something off. The way her eyes moved around our house, like she was calculating. The way she spoke to me with politeness that felt like ice underneath. But Daniel was in love. At least he thought so. They married 6 months later. Thomas squeezed my hand during the ceremony and whispered, "I hope we're wrong about her." I squeezed back, even though my heart already knew. Daniel's visits started spacing out. Every 2 weeks became monthly, then just holidays. Always an excuse: work, traffic, Claire's family obligations. When he did come, she came too, and her eyes kept evaluating, measuring, pricing everything she saw. Then Thomas got sick. Pancreatic cancer, late stage. 6 months to a year if we were lucky, the doctor said. I called Daniel crying. I needed my son. I needed him to see his father before we ran out of time. Daniel came. Claire stayed in the car. Hospitals bother her, he explained. I didn't argue. Thomas looked at me with those tired eyes that still saw everything so clearly. During those final months, I took care of Thomas with everything I had. Medicine schedules, baths when he couldn't manage alone, reading his favorite books out loud, holding his hand through the painful nights. Daniel visited, but less and less. Always with Claire waiting somewhere. Always watching the time. 2 weeks before Thomas died, he asked me to call his attorney, Patricia. She was older, a family friend for decades. Thomas closed himself in the study with her for 2 hours. I waited outside, hearing their voices but not the words. When Patricia came out, her eyes were wet. She hugged me tight. Margaret, your husband is a wise man. Trust him, even after he's gone. I didn't understand, but I nodded. Thomas died at home, in our bed, my hand in his. His last words were, "Forgive me for what's coming. It's necessary. Protect yourself." I didn't understand. I just held him until his body went cold. The funeral was full. 50 families came to say goodbye to the man who'd given them work and dignity. Daniel wore black. Claire wore burgundy, too bright for a funeral, I thought. He didn't cry. Not once, not for the father who'd given him everything. A week later, Patricia came with documents. I sat on the sofa where Thomas and I had grown old together, where we'd watched our lives unfold side by side. "Margaret, I need to read Thomas's will," she said gently but firmly. I nodded, expecting what I already knew. Everything to me, eventually to Daniel. But there was more. Something Thomas had written himself on the final pages. Patricia read slowly, like the words weighed too much. "I place all my assets, the company, properties, accounts in a trust managed by my wife Margaret, to remain under her authority until she determines otherwise. My son Daniel will receive his inheritance only when he demonstrates the character, honor, and respect I spent his lifetime trying to teach him." I went cold. What does that mean? Patricia met my eyes. "It means Thomas saw something you didn't want to see. He loved Daniel, but he didn't trust the people around him. This protects everything you built." There was more. A special clause Patricia didn't read that day. She just told me it existed. There are specific conditions under which Daniel would lose all rights to the inheritance. Forever. Thomas was very clear. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. I didn't tell Daniel everything when he came 3 days later for the official reading. He only heard that I'd manage things, that he'd receive his share when appropriate. His face tightened. Claire's lips pressed into a thin white line. But they said nothing. Not yet. I tried continuing my life. The house felt hollow without Thomas. Every corner held him. His coffee cup still sat where he'd left it that last morning he could stand. His favorite sweater hung in the closet. Sometimes I'd wake reaching for his warmth and find only cold sheets. Daniel stopped visiting entirely. When I called, always an excuse. "Swamped, Mom. We have plans, Mom." "Next week, I promise, Mom." Next week never came. 2 months after the funeral, Daniel called. "Mom, Claire and I want you over for dinner. We need to discuss some things." My heart lifted. Maybe he wanted to reconnect. Maybe losing his father had made him reflect. I baked an apple pie, his favorite since childhood. I rang the doorbell smiling, hoping we could be family again. Claire opened the door. No smile. "Come in." The house was cold. All white, gray, black. Modern furniture. No warmth. No family photographs I'd imagined my son would hang. Daniel sat in the living room, wine glass in hand. "Hey, Mom," he said without hugging me. I set the pie on the table. Nobody touched it all night. Dinner was tense. Claire barely spoke. Daniel stared at his plate like answers were written in the food. I tried making conversation, asked about work, about their plans, about how they were handling Thomas's death. "That's what we want to discuss," Claire said, fork clattering against her plate. "Thomas's money." My heart started racing. "Money? Don't play innocent, Margaret," she continued, tone sharp. "We know Thomas left considerable assets. The company's worth millions. Properties, accounts. And you control all of it." "Claire, please," Daniel said weakly, without conviction. She ignored him. "Daniel is the only child, the rightful heir. It's not fair that you, someone your age who never actually worked, who was just a housewife, control all that money." I felt slapped. "Never worked?" My voice shook. "I cleaned houses for years so Thomas could buy his first truck. I raised your husband. I kept our home running while Thomas built the company." "That's not real work," Claire said dismissively. "Anyone can clean and cook. What Thomas built was his intelligence, his effort. Not yours. Now you, an old woman who probably can't even use a computer, are going to waste everything he achieved." I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to defend me, to tell his wife she'd crossed a line. But my son just stared at his wine, swirling it slowly. "Daniel," I said, voice breaking, "do you agree with this?" He finally looked up. I saw something I'd never seen before. Not hatred, worse, indifference. Like I was an obstacle, a problem to solve. "Mom, be reasonable," he said tiredly. "You don't need all that money. You live alone in that big house. What do you need millions for? I have plans, ideas to expand the business. I can multiply what Dad built." "Your father left very specific instructions," I replied, feeling tears coming but refusing to cry in front of them. "He knew what he was doing." Claire laughed bitterly. "Of course he knew. He knew you manipulated him on his deathbed when he was weak and confused from medication. You convinced him to leave you everything." I stood so fast my chair nearly fell. "I'm not staying to listen to this. Thomas was perfectly clear when he made his will. He did it to protect his legacy." "Protect it from whom?" Claire shouted, also standing. "From his own son? You're selfish and manipulative, Margaret. A leech who lived off her husband and now plans to keep everything he earned." I left with my heart in pieces. Didn't even take the pie I'd baked with such love. I drove home crying so hard I could barely see the road. Claire's words echoed like bells. Leech, manipulator, old woman wasting money. And worst of all, Daniel hadn't said one word to defend me. My own son let me be humiliated in his home. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat on the bed I'd shared with Thomas for 45 years, looking at his photograph. "Why did you do this?" I asked his smiling face. "Why these conditions in the will? You knew this would happen." But photographs don't answer. The dead keep their secrets. The following weeks were silent hell. Daniel called once to apologize for Claire's behavior, but his words sounded rehearsed. "She was stressed, Mom. She didn't mean it. But you have to understand our position. We need that money. We have plans, investments. You can't be selfish and keep everything just because Dad left it to you." "Your father left it to me for a reason," I replied, feeling something harden inside me. Like every cruel word was building a wall around my heart. "When the time is right, you'll receive what you're owed." Daniel sighed with frustration. And when will that be? When you're 90? When I'm too old to enjoy it? It's not fair, Mom. He hung up without goodbye. I stood holding the phone, listening to the dial tone like the sound of my heart breaking repeatedly. I tried distracting myself managing the company. Patricia helped me understand numbers, contracts, operations. I discovered Thomas had been more organized than I'd imagined. Every document perfectly filed. Every decision backed by careful analysis. The company wasn't just successful, it was rock solid. But I also found something disturbing. Outstanding invoices in Daniel's name. Loans Thomas had quietly covered over the last 2 years. 30,000 here, 50,000 there. All marked personal loan to Daniel confidential. My son had been borrowing from his father. I never knew. Why didn't Thomas tell me? I asked Patricia, hand trembling over the documents. She sighed deeply. Because he knew you, Margaret. He knew you'd defend Daniel no matter what. Thomas wanted to protect you from the truth as much as he wanted to protect his company. That's why he put those clauses in the will. He saw something you didn't want to see. That night I went through Thomas's study. Every document, every email, every note. And there, hidden among business papers, a letter addressed to me in his shaky late-stage handwriting. I opened it with trembling hands. My dearest Margaret, it began. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and Daniel is probably pressuring you for money. Forgive me for not telling you sooner, but our son has problems I tried solving quietly. Gambling debts, Margaret. Serious ones. For 2 years I've been paying them off secretly, hoping he'd mature, that he'd leave those habits behind. But every time I paid one, another appeared. Claire knows. In fact, I think she encourages him. I've researched her, she has debts too. Credit cards, personal loans. They married not for love, but because they both needed money and thought I was an endless source. I had to stop. Tears were blurring everything. My son, my Daniel, who'd been so innocent, so pure. How had this happened? I kept reading, heartbreaking. I didn't tell you because I know how much you love our son. I know you'd sell everything, mortgage our house, leave yourself with nothing just to save him. But Margaret, some people don't want to be saved. Some people just want more until they destroy everything. That's why I made the will this way. To protect you, to protect what we built, and to give Daniel one last chance to show who he really is. If he comes with humility, with respect, with genuine love, you'll know my son still exists. But if he comes with lawyers, with demands, with cruelty, you'll know we lost him long ago. In that case, Margaret, show no mercy. Activate this special clause. Patricia knows what to do. Protect our legacy. Protect the 50 families. And above all, protect yourself. I love you beyond death. Forever yours, Thomas. I cried for hours, holding that letter to my chest. Thomas had known everything. He'd seen the future with clarity I, blinded by mother's love, never had. Now he'd left me with an impossible choice. Believe in my son or believe in my husband. 3 months after the funeral, while I was still processing everything, while I was still torn between love and reality, the final blow came. A yellow envelope delivered by courier. A court summons. Daniel was suing me. Not asking for part of the inheritance. Demanding everything. Absolutely everything. The company, properties, accounts, even the house where I'd raised him. His legal argument was devastating. I was elderly, mentally incompetent, incapable of managing a company. He was the rightful heir unjustly stripped of his rights by a will written under undue influence. I sat on the floor with that summons and felt the world stop. My son didn't just want the money. He wanted to declare me incompetent. He wanted to humiliate me publicly. He wanted to destroy me. I called Patricia immediately. She came that afternoon with sadness and determination mixed in her expression. "I knew this would happen," she said, sitting across from me. "Thomas warned me. That's why we drafted the will specifically this way." "Do you remember the special clause?" I nodded weakly. "It's time you knew everything." Patricia opened her briefcase, removing another document. "Thomas wrote this. If my son Daniel legally attempts to take what I've left my wife, if he sues her, if he takes her to court, if he tries declaring her incompetent, or uses any legal means to strip her of her inheritance, then he automatically forfeits all right to receive any part of my estate. Not only does he lose his future inheritance, but he is explicitly excluded forever. In that case, my wife has complete authority to dispose of all assets as she deems appropriate, including donations, sales, or any action that protects the legacy we built together." The silence was so deep I could hear my heartbeat. "You're saying if I go to court, Daniel loses everything automatically?" Patricia nodded slowly. "Exactly. Thomas knew that if your son went to the extreme of suing you, it meant nothing was left of the man you raised. This was his way of giving you definitive proof. It was also his way of protecting the company and everything he built." I walked to the window, looking at the garden Thomas and I had planted together. The rose bushes he pruned every spring were growing wild without his careful hand. What if I don't go to court? What if I just give him what he wants? "Then you'd betray your husband's final wish," Patricia replied firmly. "And you'd allow Daniel and Claire to destroy in months what took decades to build." "Margaret, I've done research. I know why they need money so desperately. Your son has gambling debts over $200,000. Claire has credit card balances totaling another $150,000. Together they owe so much that if you give them the company, they'll sell it in pieces to pay creditors. The 50 families depending on those jobs will be left with nothing." That hit me like a fist. It wasn't just about Daniel and me. 50 families trusted the company to keep running. Fathers feeding children with those salaries. Mothers paying for school and medicine. Did I have the right to sacrifice all that to save a son who clearly didn't want saving? "I need to think," I told Patricia. She put her hand on my shoulder kindly. "You have 2 weeks before the hearing." "But Margaret, you need to know something else." I hired a private investigator. What he discovered about Claire is disturbing. She left a folder on the table. This explains a lot. Read it when you're ready. After Patricia left, I stared at that folder for hours, not daring to open it. Part of me didn't want to know more. Part of me wanted to keep believing this was all a terrible misunderstanding, that my son was still there somewhere, trapped but not lost. Finally, when night had completely fallen, I opened it. What I read chilled my blood. Claire had been married before. Twice. Both marriages ended after she drained their bank accounts. First an older businessman, then a successful lawyer. Same pattern both times. Marry, gain control of finances gradually, accumulate debts in their names, disappear with what she could carry before they realized. The report had photographs. Claire at casinos, signing large checks. Claire with a man who wasn't Daniel, entering expensive hotels. Dates and places from the last 6 months after Thomas had died. My daughter-in-law hadn't just manipulated my son into suing me. She was cheating on him while doing it. The question tormenting me: should I tell Daniel the truth about his wife, or let life teach him the lesson he needed? Thomas would have known what to do. Thomas always knew. But Thomas was gone, and I had to decide alone. I spent those 2 weeks in constant agony. Every time the phone rang, I hoped it was Daniel calling to apologize, to say he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd dropped the lawsuit. But he never called. Not once. My son had chosen his path, and that path ran right through me like I was nothing. I tried calling him. 3 times I dialed and hung up before it rang. What would I say? Please don't do this? I still love you despite everything? Your father knew this would happen? Nothing seemed right. Everything seemed desperate and weak. The 4th time, I let it ring. Claire answered. What do you want, Margaret? I need to speak with my son. Your son is busy preparing for trial. The trial where he'll finally get back what rightfully belongs to him. Claire, please, I begged, hating myself for it, but unable to stop. It doesn't have to be this way. We can sit down, talk like family. She laughed cruelly. Family? You stopped being family when you decided to steal money that belonged to Daniel. See you in court, old woman. Prepare to lose everything. She hung up. I stood holding the phone, feeling the last hope of reconciliation vanish like smoke. There was no going back. Daniel had made his choice. I would have to make mine. The night before the hearing, I took out Thomas's letter and read it completely. This time I didn't cry. This time I felt something different growing inside me. Not hatred or revenge. Clarity. Thomas had left me this test knowing exactly what would happen. He'd seen something in Daniel I'd refused to see. Weakness, greed, lack of character. And he'd given me the tools to protect myself. It's okay, my love, I told Thomas's photograph that night. I'll do what you asked. I'll protect our legacy, and I'll let Daniel face the consequences of his decisions. I slept better that night than I had in 3 months. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt I wasn't completely alone. He'd foreseen this. He'd prepared me. Now it was my turn to honor his final wish. The morning of the hearing, I put on a navy dress Thomas always said made me look dignified and strong. I did my makeup carefully, not to hide my age, but to show that a 72-year-old woman could have all the dignity and strength in the world. I looked in the mirror and saw someone who'd survived 45 years of marriage, who'd built something meaningful from scratch with her husband, who'd raised a son with all her love. That woman wasn't weak. That woman wasn't incompetent. And that woman wasn't going to be destroyed without standing her ground. Patricia picked me up early. In the car, we reviewed strategy. Daniel is going to try painting you as a senile old woman who knows nothing about business. They'll bring false witnesses. They'll manipulate numbers. They'll do everything to make you look incompetent. What do we do? I asked, feeling nerves climbing my spine. Patricia looked at me with a small, determined smile. We let them bury themselves. We let them present their case, tell all their lies, show exactly who they are. When it's your turn to speak, you'll simply tell the truth. The truth Thomas left in writing. The truth none of them know yet. We arrived at the courthouse half an hour early. The building was imposing, tall columns, hallways echoing with every step. I sat on a polished wooden bench waiting, feeling every minute stretch into eternity. Then I saw them arrive. Daniel entered first, black suit making him look like a stranger. This wasn't the boy I'd raised, the young man who used to hug me and tell me I was the best mom in the world. This was someone I didn't recognize, with hard eyes and a clenched jaw. Behind him came Claire in an ivory dress and heels so high they clicked against the marble. She looked at me with a triumphant smile like she'd already won. Their lawyer was a tall, severe woman with black hair cut aggressively, carrying expensive leather briefcase and an expression saying she never lost. She introduced herself as Ms. Richardson, an estate litigation specialist. She shook my hand with a cold, calculating grip. Daniel didn't look at me. Not even once. He walked past like I was invisible, like I wasn't the woman who'd carried him 9 months, who'd walked floors with him all night when he had colic, who'd sold her own mother's jewelry to help pay his college tuition. That indifference hurt more than any insult. "All rise," the bailiff announced as the judge entered. Judge Harrison was in his 60s with perfectly combed gray hair and gold-rimmed glasses. He had the expression of someone who'd seen too many families destroy each other over money. He sat, adjusted his papers, and the hearing began. Ms. Richardson opened with a perfectly constructed narrative. She spoke of Daniel as a devoted son unjustly stripped of his inheritance by a will drafted under questionable circumstances. "Your Honor," she said in a clear, professional voice, "my client is the only son of the late Thomas Miller. Throughout his life, he was an exemplary son. He visited his parents regularly, supported them emotionally, was present for every important moment." I had to bite my tongue. For the last 3 years, Daniel had been absent more than present. But Patricia put her hand on mine under the table, reminding me to wait my turn. "However," Ms. Richardson continued, "after his father's death, my client discovered he'd been almost completely excluded from the inheritance. Everything was left in the hands of Mrs. Margaret Miller, a 72-year-old woman with no business experience, no formal education in administration, without the necessary skills to manage a company worth over $5 million. $5 million. First time I'd heard that figure spoken aloud. Thomas and I had built something worth $5 million from a single old truck. And now my son wanted to take it all. Your Honor, the lawyer pulled documents from her briefcase. We have evidence that Mrs. Miller has been making questionable financial decisions since her husband's death. She's rejected lucrative buyout offers. She's held properties that could be sold for significant profit. Most worryingly, she's refused to consult with her son, the natural heir, on any important decisions. All lies. I hadn't rejected any offers because I hadn't received any. I held properties because they generated steady income. The reason I didn't consult with Daniel was he'd never asked about the business until he found out how much money was involved. Then they called the first witness, a man introducing himself as a financial advisor who supposedly worked with Thomas. I'd never seen him before in my life. He testified that Thomas had expressed concerns about my mental capacity in his final months. He said his wife was confused, forgetting important things, having difficulty understanding basic financial concepts. He lied brazenly under oath. Patricia stood immediately. Objection, Your Honor. This witness never worked with Mr. Thomas Miller. He doesn't appear in any company documents. No payment records in his name. No emails or correspondence proving he had any contact with the deceased. Judge Harrison frowned, looking at Ms. Richardson. Do you have proof this witness actually worked with Mr. Miller? The lawyer hesitated for a split second, barely perceptible, but I saw it. He worked as an external consultant, Your Honor. Not all consultants appear on official payroll. The judge didn't look convinced, but allowed the testimony to continue. The supposed advisor kept lying, saying Thomas had mentioned several times wanting Daniel to take control, but I'd manipulated him to change the will. When that witness finished, they called another, then another, each one with a different story, all painting me as senile, manipulative, incapable. I wondered where they'd found all these people willing to lie under oath. Then I remembered Daniel and Claire's debts. When you owe that much money, finding people to lie is just a matter of paying them. Finally, after 2 hours of false testimony, the moment I'd been dreading arrived. Ms. Richardson called Daniel to the stand. My son walked with steady gait, raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth. Then he sat and looked directly at me for the first time all morning. His eyes were filled with something it took me a moment to identify: resentment. Pure, simple resentment. "Mr. Miller," his lawyer began in a soft, almost motherly voice, "tell us about your relationship with your mother." Daniel sighed like it pained him to speak. "My mother was always very controlling," he said, each word like a knife. "Even when I was young, everything had to be her way. My father was always working, so she was the one really running the house. A lie. I'd been strict when necessary, like any mother, but never controlling. I'd supported Daniel's every decision, every dream, every plan. When my father got sick," Daniel continued, voice taking on a perfectly rehearsed victim tone, "she wouldn't let me be alone with him. She was always there, monitoring every conversation, controlling who could visit and when. I understand why now. She was making sure my father would change his will in her favor." "That's not true," I shouted, unable to stop myself. The judge banged his gavel. "Order in the court. Mrs. Miller, you'll have your chance to speak. For now, remain silent, or I'll have you removed." I bit my lip until I tasted blood. Patricia squeezed my hand hard. Daniel kept talking, building a narrative where I was the villain and he was the poor son robbed by his greedy mother. He talked about how I'd cut all contact after Thomas's death, how I refused answering his calls or meeting with him. He omitted the part where he'd stopped visiting me first, that his only calls were demands for money, that the only meeting we had ended with his wife calling me a leech. "My mother never worked a single day in her life," Daniel said with conviction that made me wonder if he believed his own lies or was just such a good actor he could fool himself. "Everything we have was built by my father. He was the genius, the hard worker, the visionary. She was just a housewife. Now she's pretending to control an empire she didn't build, doesn't understand, and is destined to destroy through her own ignorance." Every word was venom dripping into my ears. Is this how my son saw me? Did he not remember the nights I spent ironing his clothes so he'd look nice for school? Did he not remember I sold the only gold ring my mother left me to pay for his summer camp? Did he not remember I worked cleaning houses on my knees on other people's floors so his father could buy that first truck? And now, Daniel's voice broke with emotion that would have seemed genuine if I didn't know the truth, "I'm here because I have no other choice. My mother has become irrational. She spends money on unnecessary things. She rejects advice from professionals. Most worrying is she's showing clear signs of mental decline. She forgets conversations. She confuses dates. Sometimes she doesn't even remember if she's taken her medication." That's when I lost it. I shot up from my chair so fast it fell backward with a crash echoing through the room. "Lair," I screamed with all the strength in my lungs. "How dare you? How dare you invent those lies about your own mother?" Judge Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly. "Mrs. Miller, this is your final warning. Sit down immediately, or I'll have you removed from this courtroom." Patricia pulled me down by the arm, whispering urgently, "Margaret, control yourself. This is exactly what they want. They're trying to make you look unstable. Don't give them what they're looking for." I sat down, trembling with rage and pain. Daniel looked at me with an expression that could have passed for concern if I hadn't seen the hidden satisfaction in his eyes. He was enjoying this. My son was enjoying watching me suffer. Ms. Richardson used my outburst perfectly. "As you can see, Your Honor, Mrs. Miller is exhibiting erratic and irrational behavior. She cannot control her emotions, even in a formal setting like this court. How can we trust her to make rational decisions about millions of dollars and the future of 50 families depending on that company?" Then Claire was called to the stand. She swore to tell the truth with her hand on the Bible, and I wondered if the book would burst into flames from contact with such falsehood. She sat with perfect posture, crossed her legs elegantly, began her performance. "My mother-in-law has always treated me with hostility," she said in a soft victim-like voice. "From the day I met Daniel, I think she couldn't accept that her son had his own life, his own family. I tried getting close to her many times. I'd invite her to dinner. I'd call her. I'd send flowers on her birthday. But she always rejected me with coldness. Lies, all lies. I'd welcomed her with open arms. I'd tried knowing her, understanding her, loving her like a daughter. But she'd always looked at me with those calculating eyes, evaluating, measuring, planning. After my father-in-law passed away," Claire continued, voice adopting deep sadness, "the situation got worse. Margaret became paranoid. She accused us of only wanting money. She'd scream at us when we tried visiting. Once, she even threatened calling the police if we didn't get off her property. That part had happened. But she conveniently left out they'd shown up unannounced with a notary, demanding I sign papers giving them power of attorney over my bank accounts. Of course I kicked them out. Any sane person would have. What worries me most," Claire said, looking directly at the judge with eyes glistening with perfectly timed fake tears, "is that Margaret is putting Thomas's legacy at risk. He worked his entire life to build that company, and now it's in the hands of someone who knows nothing about business, who refuses listening to advice, who's letting it all deteriorate out of sheer pride and stubbornness." Judge Harrison was taking notes as Claire spoke. I tried reading his expression, but it was impossible. He was a professional who'd perfected the art of not showing what he was thinking. When Claire finished, she returned to her seat next to Daniel, who took her hand in a gesture of support that made me sick. Ms. Richardson approached the judge's bench with a confidence of victory. "Your Honor, we have clearly demonstrated that Mrs. Margaret Miller lacks the mental capacity and necessary experience to manage an estate of this magnitude. We've shown her behavior is erratic, her decisions questionable, and she represents a real risk to the economic well-being not only of my client but of the 50 families depending on that company." She took a dramatic pause. "Therefore, we request Mrs. Miller be declared incompetent to manage the inheritance, that she be removed as executor of the will, and that all assets be immediately transferred to my client, Daniel Miller, who, as the only son and rightful heir, has the legal and moral right to receive what his father built." The judge nodded and looked toward our table. "Does the defense wish to present its case?" Patricia stood slowly with the calm of someone holding a winning hand. "Yes, Your Honor, and it will be brief because the truth doesn't need to be complicated." My heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. This was the moment. Patricia began in a clear voice. "Your Honor, Everything you've heard this morning is a carefully constructed narrative based on lies, false witnesses, and emotional manipulation. The truth is much simpler and is documented in the original will of Thomas Miller, a document drafted with full mental lucidity, certified by doctors, witnessed by public notaries. She pulled a folder from her briefcase. But before we get into legal details, I'd like Mrs. Margaret Miller to share something with this court. Something her son has clearly forgotten or chosen to ignore. Margaret, please take the stand. I stood on trembling legs. I walked to the stand, feeling the weight of all those eyes on me. The bailiff had me swear to tell the truth. I put my hand on the Bible and swore, knowing every word I was about to say was true, even if it hurt, even if it destroyed my son, even if it ended any chance of reconciliation. I sat and looked Judge Harrison directly in the eye. Your Honor, my name is Margaret Miller. I'm 72 years old. I was married to Thomas Miller for 45 years until his death 6 months ago. And I'm here because my only son is suing me for money he believes belongs to him. My voice sounded firmer than I expected. Patricia had prepared me for this moment, but nothing could truly prepare me to look my son in the eye as I destroyed his lies one by one. My son says I never worked. That is a lie. I worked cleaning houses for 10 years so his father could buy his first truck. I worked in the company office for another 20 years doing bookkeeping, handling clients, organizing routes. I don't have a college degree in business, that's true. But I built this company alongside my husband, brick by brick, with my own hands. I saw Daniel's jaw clench. Claire was whispering something in his ear, probably telling him to stay calm. My son says I've excluded him from my life after his father's death. That is also a lie. He stopped visiting me long before that. The only times he's called in the last 6 months have been to demand money. My son says I show signs of dementia, that I forget things, that I'm irrational. That is completely false. I took a folder from my bag that Patricia had given me that morning. I have medical reports here from the last 3 months. Complete cognitive exams performed by 3 different neurologists. They all certify I'm in full command of my mental faculties. My memory is perfect. My judgment is clear. I'm more than capable of making my own decisions. Judge Harrison held out his hand and the bailiff took the documents to him. I watched as he reviewed them carefully, his eyebrows raising slightly. These are very thorough reports, he commented. Why did you decide to have these exams, Mrs. Miller? Because my lawyer warned me this would happen, I replied, looking directly at Daniel. She told me my son would try declaring me incompetent to steal what his father left me. So I prepared. I made sure I had all necessary documentation to prove I'm perfectly sane and capable. Patricia then approached with another folder. Your Honor, we also have the company's financial statements for the last 6 months, since Mrs. Miller took full control. The company has increased its profits by 22%. She's closed 3 major new contracts. She's improved working conditions for employees. And she's maintained 0 debt. For someone supposedly incompetent, those are extraordinary results. I saw Ms. Richardson's face turn pale. They clearly hadn't expected us to have such thorough documentation. The judge reviewed the financial statements with growing interest. These numbers are impressive, he admitted. Mrs. Miller, how did you achieve this growth? By listening to the people who actually know the business, I answered honestly. The managers my husband trained for years, the drivers who've been with us from the beginning. I don't pretend to know everything, Your Honor. But I know how to recognize talent and loyalty when I see them. And I know my responsibility isn't just to protect the money, but to protect the 50 families depending on this company to survive. Then Patricia dropped the bomb I'd been waiting for. Your Honor, there is something the plaintiff and his counsel don't know about Thomas Miller's will. Something that changes this case completely. She took out a thick document and placed it before the judge. This is the complete will, not the summarized version read after the funeral. It contains specific clauses never publicly disclosed. The judge took the document and began reading. The silence in the room was so deep I could hear my own breathing. I watched the judge's eyes move from line to line, his expression gradually changing from neutral to surprised, then to something that looked like respect mixed with sadness. "This is extraordinary," the judge muttered, more to himself than to the room. He looked up and stared directly at Daniel. "Mr. Miller, did you know about this clause in your father's will?" Daniel looked confused. "What clause, Your Honor?" "I read the will. Everything was left to my mother with some vague promise I'd get my share when appropriate." "There's more to it than that," the judge said in a grave voice. "Much more." He looked at Patricia. "Do you want to explain, or would you prefer I read it aloud?" Patricia looked at me, and I nodded. It was time for the whole truth to come out. "Allow me," Patricia said, taking the document. Her voice filled the room with the words Thomas had written, knowing exactly what would happen. The will of Thomas Miller. Special clauses drafted 2 weeks prior to his death. I, Thomas Miller, being of sound mind and body, as certified by the doctors present, do hereby establish the following. All my assets are to be placed in a trust managed by my wife, Margaret Miller. My son Daniel is not excluded from this inheritance, but his access to it is conditional. Daniel leaned forward in his chair, finally paying full attention. The conditions are these, Patricia continued. Daniel will receive his inheritance when he fulfills any of the following requirements. First, that he demonstrates for a minimum period of 2 years that he can hold a stable job and live within his means, without accumulating gambling debts or irresponsible loans. Second, that he shows genuine respect toward his mother and acknowledges the sacrifice both his parents made for him. Third, that he demonstrates real interest in the well-being of the company and its employees, not just in its monetary value. Daniel's face had gone from confusion to horror. But there is an additional clause, Patricia said, her voice turning harder, a clause Thomas hoped never to use, but which he included as a precaution. And I quote directly, "If my son Daniel sues his mother, takes her to court, attempts to declare her incompetent, or in any way uses legal means to try and strip her of what I have left her, then he automatically and irrevocably forfeits all right to any part of my estate. In that case, Margaret will have absolute authority to dispose of all assets as she deems appropriate, including full donation, if she so chooses." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched the color drain from Daniel's face. I saw Claire half rise from her chair in disbelief. I saw Ms. Richardson close her eyes, knowing she'd just lost the case before it ever really began. "No," Daniel whispered. "That can't be real. My father wouldn't do that." Judge Harrison held up the document. This will was drafted before 3 public notaries, 2 doctors who certified Mr. Miller's mental capacity, and was legally registered. It is completely valid. I stood from the stand. Patricia had told me this was my moment, the moment to say the 3 words that would change everything. I walked to the center of the room, looking my son directly in the eyes for the first time with absolute clarity about who he really was. "I inherited nothing," I said, my voice clear and strong. echoing in every corner of that room. The 3 words I'd rehearsed, that I dreaded saying, but now came out with absolute certainty. Everyone stared at me, uncomprehending. Judge Harrison frowned. "What do you mean by that, Mrs. Miller?" I took a deep breath before continuing. "I mean exactly that, Your Honor. I inherited nothing. My husband didn't leave me his fortune. What my husband did was put me in charge of protecting his legacy until his son proved himself worthy of receiving it. I'm not the owner of those $5 million. I'm the guardian, the protector. My job was to wait and see what kind of man my son would become when faced with the temptation of easy money." I saw Judge Harrison begin to understand. I saw something in his expression change, as if he were seeing the brilliance of Thomas's plan for the first time. "Your husband created a test," he said slowly. "A test of character." I nodded, feeling tears finally start rolling down my cheeks but making no attempt to stop them. "Exactly. Thomas knew money changes people. He wanted to know if his son valued his fortune or his family more. He wanted to know if Daniel would be able to wait, to respect, to trust. Or if he'd immediately run to the courts to take by force what his father wanted to give him with love." I turned to Daniel, who now had his head in his hands. "And now I have my answer. Now I know what you chose, son. You chose the money. You chose to believe a woman you've known 3 years over the mother who raised you for 45. You chose to humiliate me in public, to declare me incompetent, to destroy my reputation. And because of that choice, by bringing this case to court, you've activated the clause your father dreaded having to use." Daniel's head snapped up. His eyes red, whether from rage or tears, I couldn't tell. "This is a trap," he shouted, jumping to his feet. "It's a cruel trap. My father set me up so I could never get what's mine." His voice was breaking with every word, but I no longer felt pity for him, only the terrible weight of the truth Thomas had seen long before I had. "It wasn't a trap," I said, my voice firmer than I felt inside. "It was an opportunity. An opportunity to prove you'd learned the values we tried to teach you. Your father loved you so much he was willing to risk his entire legacy just to give you one last lesson about what really matters in life. Not money, not power, but character, integrity, respect." Judge Harrison banged his gavel, demanding order. Because Claire had also stood up screaming that this was all a conspiracy, that Patricia and I had forged documents, that we'd manipulated the will after Thomas's death. But her voice sounded desperate, like someone watching their house of cards collapse. "Order," the judge roared with an authority that made everyone fall silent instantly. "Sit down immediately, or I'll clear this courtroom." Claire and Daniel slumped back into their chairs. Ms. Richardson had her head down, frantically shuffling through papers as if she could find some legal escape from this disaster. Patricia used the moment to present more evidence. "Your Honor, there's something else the court needs to know. Something that explains why Daniel needs this money so desperately." She pulled out another folder, filled with documents I'd reviewed weeks ago, but which still pained me every time I saw them. For the last 3 years, Daniel Miller has accumulated gambling debts totaling $243,000. We have records from casinos, receipts from private lenders, bank statements showing constant withdrawals and deposits not corresponding to any known legitimate income. Patricia placed documents on the judge's desk one by one, painting a devastating picture. Daniel was as pale as a ghost. Additionally, Patricia continued without mercy, his wife Claire has credit card debts of $162,000. Together, they owe over $400,000 to various creditors. Some of those creditors are not exactly legitimate banking institutions. We've identified at least 3 loans with organizations that could be described as predatory lenders with connections to criminal activities. Judge Harrison looked at the documents with an increasingly serious expression. Are you saying the plaintiff and his wife are being pressured by criminals to pay these debts? Patricia nodded. Exactly, Your Honor. This lawsuit was never about inheritance rights or genuine concern for Margaret's well-being. It was a desperate attempt to get fast cash to pay off dangerous debts. That's not true, Claire shouted, but her voice lacked conviction. You're making all this up to make Daniel look bad. Patricia turned to her with a look that could cut steel. Would you like me to bring the lenders in as witnesses? Because several of them would be happy to testify about the missed payments and the threats they've made. In fact, we have recordings of phone calls where they discuss exactly that. Claire fell silent, finally defeated. Daniel had his head in his hands again, his shoulders shaking. I didn't know if he was crying or just trying to disappear. Part of me, the part that was still his mother, wanted to go to him, to hug him and tell him everything would be okay. But the other part, the part Thomas had prepared for this moment, knew I needed to see this through to the end. There is one final piece of evidence, Patricia said, her voice now holding a note of genuine sadness. Something Margaret didn't want us to present. But I insisted because the court needs to see the full picture. She took out a manila envelope and extracted several photographs. These are photographs taken by a private investigator over the last 3 months. They show Claire Miller in the company of another man. Not her husband, entering hotels, expensive restaurants, always paid for with credit cards in both of their names. The photographs were passed from hand to hand until they reached the judge. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. There was Claire laughing with a younger man, entering a luxury hotel, her hand on his back with a familiarity that left no doubt. The dates on the photos corresponded to days when she'd told Daniel she had work meetings or family commitments. Daniel finally looked up as the bailiff placed the photographs before him. I saw the exact moment his world fell apart. I watched him look at each image, his face shifting from disbelief to recognition, then to total devastation. He turned slowly toward Claire, who was now staring at the floor with no defense possible. Claire. His voice was just a broken whisper. What is this? She didn't answer. She couldn't. There were no words that could explain the inexplicable. There were no excuses that could justify the unjustifiable. Her silence was answer enough. Your Honor, Patricia said, retaking control of the room, we present all this evidence not to humiliate the plaintiff, but to show the full context of this lawsuit. Daniel Miller didn't come to this court because he was worried about his mother's well-being or his father's legacy. He came because he's desperate, manipulated, and trapped in a situation he created with his own bad decisions. Instead of asking his family for help, he chose to destroy it. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, taking off his glasses to rub his tired eyes. He'd seen many horrible family cases in his career, but even for him, this seemed particularly painful. I need a recess, he finally announced. 30 minutes. When I return, I'll give my verdict. He stood and left through a back door. The bailiff announced the recess, and suddenly everyone was in motion. Daniel was still sitting motionless, staring at the photographs as if he could change what they showed just by looking at them long enough. Claire stood up quickly and tried to leave the courtroom, but Daniel grabbed her by the arm. Don't you dare leave, he said in a voice I'd never heard from him before, a voice full of pain and rage and betrayal. You stay here and face what you did. You owe me that much at least. She ripped her arm away with a violent tug. I don't owe you anything. You're just as guilty as I am. You're the one who agreed to sue your own mother. I just gave you the push you needed. For the money? Daniel asked, tears streaming freely down his face. You did all this for money? The hotels with that man? Convincing me to destroy my relationship with my mother? All for money? Claire laughed bitterly, ugly. And why did you do it? For the love of justice? Don't be a hypocrite, Daniel. We both wanted the money. The difference is, at least I'm honest about it. She left then, her heels echoing on the marble floor like gunshots. Daniel was left alone at his table, surrounded by the wreckage of his life. Ms. Richardson gathered her things quickly and left too, probably already calculating how to distance herself from this disastrous case before it affected her reputation. I slowly approached Daniel. Patricia tried to stop me, but I shook my head. I needed to do this. I sat in the chair next to him, where Claire had been sitting just moments before. Mom, he said without looking at me, his voice broken in 1,000 pieces. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know how I got to this point. I don't know when I became this person. I placed my hand on the hand I'd held when he took his first steps, that I'd bandaged when he scraped his knees playing, that I'd clapped for at every one of his achievements. I don't know either, son. But I know your father saw this coming long before any of us. That's why he did what he did. Not to punish you, but to give you a chance to wake up before it was too late. But it is too late, Daniel whispered. I've lost everything, the inheritance, my marriage, your respect, everything. I looked at him then, really looked at him, trying to find the boy he'd been in the broken man who sat before me. You haven't lost everything, I said softly. You're still alive. You can still change. You can still become the man your father hoped you'd be. But Daniel, that has to start with you. Not with money, not with inheritances, but with looking in the mirror and deciding who you want to be. He finally looked at me, his eyes red and swollen. Can you ever forgive me? The question broke my heart because I didn't have an easy answer. I don't know, I admitted honestly. What you did today, how you humiliated me, the lies you told about me, that doesn't get erased easily. But you are my son, and that's a connection that not even you could completely break, even though you tried with all your might. The bailiff announced the judge was returning. Daniel and I separated, each returning to our side of the room. But something had changed in those 30 minutes. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't even forgiveness. It was simply the acknowledgement of a painful truth we'd both have to carry for the rest of our lives. Judge Harrison entered with a solemn expression. He sat, organized his papers, and looked at all of us with the gravity of someone about to change lives forever. I have reviewed all the evidence presented. I have read the complete will of Thomas Miller multiple times. And I must say, in 30 years on the bench, I have never seen a document so meticulously designed, nor a situation so tragically predictable. He paused, letting his words settle in the room. Mr. Thomas Miller was not just a successful businessman. He was a man who deeply understood human nature. He saw the weakness in his son, and instead of simply disinheriting him, he gave him a test, an opportunity to prove that the values he tried to instill in him his entire life had taken root enough to withstand the temptation of easy money. The judge looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Miller, you failed that test. You didn't just fail it, you failed it in the most spectacular way possible. You sued your own mother. You attempted to declare her incompetent with false testimony. You humiliated her publicly with baseless accusations. And you did it all while your wife was deceiving you. While you were both racking up debts you planned to pay with your family's money. Daniel had lowered his head again, unable to meet the judge's gaze. Therefore, Judge Harrison continued, his voice resonating with final authority. In accordance with the specific clauses of the will of Thomas Miller, I declare that Daniel Miller has irrevocably forfeited all right to any part of his father's inheritance. The lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice, meaning it cannot be filed again. And Mrs. Margaret Miller maintains complete authority over all assets of the estate to dispose of them as she deems appropriate. The gavel struck the desk with a sound that signaled the end of everything. There were no shouts, no protests, just a heavy, definitive silence. Ms. Richardson had disappeared during the recess and never returned. Claire was gone too. Daniel was left alone in his defeat, surrounded by the consequences of every bad decision he'd made for the last 3 years. I left the courthouse with Patricia by my side. The sun was shining outside, a cruel contrast to the darkness of what had just happened inside. You did it, Patricia said, putting a hand on my shoulder. You protected Thomas's legacy exactly as he wanted. I nodded, but I didn't feel victorious. I just felt an enormous emptiness where my family used to be. The next few days were strange. News of the trial had leaked in the business community. Some called to congratulate me, others just to gossip. I ignored them all. I shut myself in the house Thomas and I had built together. And for the first time in months, I allowed myself to truly grieve, not just for my husband, but for my son. Because even though Daniel was still alive, the son I knew had died somewhere during those last 3 years. 2 weeks after the trial, I made a decision. I called Patricia and asked her to set up a meeting with the company's senior managers and employee representatives. When everyone was gathered in the conference room Thomas had used for decades, I explained my plan. The company is worth $5 million, I began, looking at the faces of people who'd worked faithfully beside my husband for years. And after much reflection, I've decided what to do with it. I'm going to create a trust that will ensure the company continues to operate, that all of you keep your jobs, and that profits are distributed fairly among everyone who contributes to its success. I saw surprise on their faces. Additionally, I continued, I'm going to donate $2 million to organizations that help people with gambling addictions and victims of financial abuse. I'll do it in Thomas's name because I know he would have wanted his legacy to help prevent other families from going through what we went through. One of the oldest managers, a man named Marcus who'd worked with Thomas from the beginning, raised his hand. And what about you, Mrs. Miller? What will you do with the rest? I smiled for the first time in weeks. With the rest, I'm going to live modestly, just as Thomas and I always lived. I don't need mansions or luxuries. I need peace and the knowledge that I honored the final wish of the man I loved for 45 years. 1 month after the trial, Daniel showed up at my door. I hadn't spoken to him since that day in court. He looked different, thinner, with deep dark circles under his eyes, wearing simple clothes instead of his expensive suits. "Can I come in?" he asked in a barely audible voice. I let him in, and we sat in the same living room where we used to watch movies when he was a boy. "I divorced Claire," he said after a long silence. Or rather, she divorced me the moment it was clear there'd be no money. She disappeared with that man from the photographs. Didn't even leave a note. I didn't say anything. I just waited for him to continue. I sold everything I owned to pay the most urgent debts, my car, my furniture, my expensive clothes, everything. And I still owe almost $100,000. Money I'll probably never be able to repay. Why are you here, Daniel? I finally asked. He looked at me with eyes that finally seemed to see reality clearly. Because I need to tell you something. Something I should have said months ago. You were right. Dad was right. I became someone unrecognizable. I let greed and Claire and my own weaknesses turn me into a monster capable of destroying his own mother for money. The tears were streaming down his face, now genuine tears of remorse that no performance could fake. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness because I know I don't deserve it. I'm not here to ask for money because I know I lost that right forever. I'm just here to tell you I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every cruel word I said in that courtroom. I'm sorry for every lie I told. I'm sorry for wasting the last lesson Dad tried to teach me. I felt something inside me begin to soften, but not completely. The pain was still too fresh, the betrayal too deep. I appreciate you coming to say this, I replied carefully. But Daniel, words are easy. True repentance is shown through actions over time, not with an apology in a moment of desperation. He nodded, wiping his tears on the back of his hand. I know, that's why I'm not asking you to forgive me now. I'm just telling you I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to become the man Dad hoped I'd be. The man you and he deserved as a son. Even if it's too late to get back what I lost, it's not too late to change who I am. He got up to leave, but before he reached the door, he turned back one last time. One more thing, Mom. Thank you. I frowned, confused. Thank you for what? For not giving up on Dad's will. For being strong enough to do what he asked, even though it meant losing me. Because if you'd given me that money when I demanded it, I would have ended up dead or in jail. By denying me, even though it doesn't seem like it now, you probably saved my life. He left then, and I was alone again in that house full of memories. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of defeat, but the silence of resolution. Thomas had been right about everything about Daniel, about Claire, about what money can do to people. And he'd left me the tools to protect his legacy and, perhaps without knowing it, to save our son from himself. 6 months later, the company was still growing. The employees worked with renewed pride, knowing they were part of something bigger than just a business. The families depending on those salaries could sleep peacefully. And the name Thomas Miller had become synonymous with integrity in our community. Daniel got a job as a truck driver, the same job his father had done 45 years ago when he started. I saw him occasionally, always from a distance, always with that look of humble determination of someone rebuilding his life from scratch. We hadn't spoken again since that day in my living room, but I kept up with him through other people. I heard he was paying off his debts little by little. I heard he'd started attending meetings for people with gambling addictions. I heard he was living in a small apartment and that every penny he earned went toward what he owed or his basic needs. One evening, while looking through old photographs of Thomas and me, I found one last letter he'd hidden between the pages of our wedding album. It was addressed to me with instructions to open it only after it's all over. With trembling hands, I broke the seal. My dearest Margaret, it said in his familiar handwriting. If you're reading this, it means my plan worked, though probably at a terrible cost to your mother's heart. I know you loved Daniel more than your own life. I know protecting him was your strongest instinct. That's why I knew I needed to make this decision for you. Not because I didn't trust you, but because I know you too well. You would have sacrificed everything. You would have given every last cent just to save our son, and in doing so, you would have destroyed him completely. Sometimes the greatest love is letting people face the consequences of their actions. It's the hardest thing a parent can do, but it's the only thing that can truly save them. I hope Daniel understands this one day. I hope he uses this second chance we gave him. And if he doesn't, at least you'll know we tried everything we could. I love you beyond time and death. And even though I'm not there to hold your hand, I hope you feel my presence every time you have to make a hard decision, because the best decisions are rarely the easy ones. Forever yours, Thomas. I folded the letter carefully and held it to my heart. Thomas was right, as always. The best legacy isn't the money you leave. It's the character you build. It's the strength you inspire. It's the love that holds firm even when it hurts. That night, for the first time since his death, I slept soundly. I dreamed of Thomas when he was young, with his bright smile and strong hands, building something beautiful from nothing. And when I woke up, I knew with absolute certainty I'd honored his memory in the only way that truly mattered. The real legacy isn't what you leave in the bank. It's what you leave in people's hearts. And money can never buy what Daniel lost that day in court, the unconditional love and respect of his mother. But it also can't buy what he finally gained, the chance to become the man he was always supposed to be. If you've ever been betrayed for money, if your own family has ever turned its back on you out of greed, remember this: dignity is not inherited, it is built. And sometimes true love means saying no, even when it breaks your heart. Because only in the deepest darkness can we find the strength to become the light we were always meant to be.